Nearly 200 nations have assembled here this week. A declaration that for all the challenges we face, the growing threat of climate change could define the contours of this century more dramatically than any other.
I hope while he's talking about climate change in Paris, he's also talking about how can the NATO forces and the U.S. coalition's forces and possibly the Russians work to defeat and destroy ISIS.
Let's talk about it with our panel now that the president is in Paris at the conference. Syndicated columnist George Will. Juan Williams, columnist with The Hill, and syndicated columnist Charles Krauthammer. All right, George, I'll start with you. The president said having this gathering to discuss climate change there in Paris is an act of defiance against the terrorists. Your take?
The people of ISIS, wherever they are in northern Iraq, are what, saying, oh, we've been rebuked? This is part of the problem, that everything is said to confirm global warming. And global warming is now said to cause everything else. So it's a theory that can't be refuted, which means it's no longer a scientific theory. The amazing thing is, never in history, anywhere ever, has all the power of the modern state, supplemented by mass education, supplemented by the mass media, supplemented by journalism and entertainment, been all employed for 30 years to propagandize about this sort of thing, about global warming and all the rest, to almost no effect. Fewer Americans carpool today to work than carpooled in 1980. SUVs have never been a larger proportion of the vehicles being sold in this country. The American people may profess occasionally to be concerned about global warming, but their behavior tells you that none of this propaganda has had any effect.
And Juan, when Britt had his commentary a little bit earlier in the show, he pointed out the fact that when you ask people about real-life impacts on them, would you pay more for gasoline? Would you pay more for electricity? The percentages were up in the 60s and 70% who oppose that if it would in some way allegedly counteract climate change. So a lot of folks just don't want to get on board, as George pointed out as well.
Yeah, I think without leadership, without being able to persuade people of the importance of the issue, there's almost no base here. If you look at the poll numbers, it's very low. It's not a priority for the American people. And I think you see this reflected in the Congress, especially the Republican majority in Congress. They have no interest in dealing with this issue, dealing with cap and trade. That issue is basically stalled in a Republican Congress. So the president is trying to offer some vision. He's trying to use executive orders, changing regulations at the EPA, trying to use his stature as, you know, the leader of the free world to rally some kind of international coalition that will say, we will do something, because the Congress is not going to do anything at the moment.
Well, and you mentioned how much people do or don't care about this in polling. Our most recent Fox News polling on the most important issue facing the country, and this is from mid-November, terrorism is at the top of the list firmly with 24%. You got to go down a long ways to find climate change, and it's 3%, Charles. So why this continued campaign by the administration and many, I mean, hundreds of leaders around the world gathering in Paris?
Because this president lives in a world that is idealistic, if you want to be favorable to it, and benign about idealistic and deluded undergraduate imaginations. This is as if the League of Nations and the UN and everything in between hadn't happened. It's like Woodrow. Remember, Obama had a summit in Washington a few years ago to end nuclear proliferation. Brought in a whole bunch. He thought it was a great event. Of course, it did. I remember the one announcement of a success was that Canada had given away some extra surplus stuff, as if the threat to the world is from Canada. He lives in a world where people get together, reasonable, educated, Harvard Law School people from all over the world, and agree on futuristic designs that mean nothing, like the League of Nations, like the UN. But we have learned something since then. He has learned nothing. And this global warming is the same thing. Nothing will come of it, because it's not a treaty. It would never get through the Senate. It's not going to be binding on anybody. And the Chinese, in the great announcement he made when he was in China about the breakthrough with China, is that we would radically reduce our emissions by 2025, and China would begin its reductions in 2030. And he thought that was a triumph. Look, he asked, this is wonderful, he said, what greater rejection of those who would tear down our world than the meeting? Well, how about a serious air campaign over Syria? How about destroying their oil infrastructure for a start? But that doesn't occur to him.
Well, I just think it is a defiance. I disagree with you and with George on this. I think the ISIS people want us to be afraid. They don't want world leaders coming to Paris. I think that's why you see all that security. So in a sense, it is, you know, I'm sure they're not sitting there saying, oh, gosh, President Obama and President Hollande got together. It's a rebuke of our standards. But you know what? They defied the fear that would say, don't go there.
But do you think that they sit back and think, they've got us, they're right, this climate change has driven us to chop people's heads off?
No, that's not the issue. I mean, but
no,
that's
that's
not
what the administration says is the issue. I mean, they're saying that there's unrest and there are weather problems.
To my mind, you can do two things at once. Disingenuous to say you either do terrorism or you do climate change.
But Obama's the one who's connected them. That's the point. There's a rebuke against terrorism. I would agree that terrorism and climate change are different, but Obama pretends that this is so visionary that it actually is a way to rebuke them. The idea that the terrorists attacked in Paris because they wanted to prevent the leaders of the world of having a
but they want to scare us.
The rise of the oceans in 100 years is simply absurd.
Well, the idea that people are driven to desperation and hence to terrorism by climate change neglects another competing fact. There are 1 billion people on this planet who have no electricity. Now, I would think that that might make them more irritable, if you will, than climate change.
Well, and Juan, how do you answer, critics who say, as Charles pointed out, that China has been less committal, and India and some others with very specific guidelines. We're committing, I think, to cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 26 to 28% within a very short time frame, where they're saying they're going to work on it. They're thinking about it. There are critics who say when we have tougher standards here and they don't commit to the regulations there, manufacturers, other companies are going to want to go places where there is lax enforcement, like in China.
Well, I think the bigger issue is we don't see that the Chinese are enforcing the deal that's there right now, even. So the question is about enforcement. You got to have it, otherwise it's not real. But the larger point, I think, is that the United States, which has, of course, historically the coal industry has been so big here, and we ship it overseas, has to show some leadership. Otherwise, these other countries, they're never going to do anything. They have no reason to do anything.
But here's Obama showing leadership, and the Chinese in the first 9 months of the year have been licensing 4 coal-fired plants a week, and we're closing ours. So how is that helping the globe? And
there are numerous battles, obviously court battles and others going on, George, to that end, about these EPA regulations and just how far the power can go.
Well, it's over climate change that I think Congress will finally find its footing and say that executive power stops here. They can do that.
All right, we'll see.